Today is Monday, September the 10th, and this is The Drill. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo rather than defining my conservatism by where I stand on the issues. So, to give you an example, an excellent example of what kind of influence that the left has in this country culturally, I was listening to a radio program last night. Every Sunday, this program comes on. It lasts about a half an hour, and it's done by an amateur, a man that sounds like he's fresh off the boat from I don't know where, but with his accent. He's got a very thick accent of some sort, not Hispanic or Asian or any type of accent I recognize. Might be Eastern European, something of that nature. But anyways, he runs a window company. They replace your windows. And so he started advertising on the radio and then bought himself some airtime and now has a weekly show that's a half an hour long. Most of it of the time he is very pro-American, thank God for God bless America because it gave me the opportunity I couldn't get in my home country to do what I need to do business-wise and to live the kind of lifestyle I want to live. So he was last night, all of a sudden he had a different attitude about everything. He said he didn't want to talk, and sometimes he also discusses politics, so he kind of weighs in on his political viewpoint, which seemed to be, for the most part, right of center. Now, last night he was sick of politics. He wants to go find an island to live on for, take a vacation on, for a couple of weeks. Leave all the smartphones and all that behind. Go live on the beach for a couple of weeks and do nothing but read and eat coconuts. So, okay, good for you. And then he starts talking about lifestyle choices, and not just his own lifestyle choices, but of everybody's lifestyle choices. He starts criticizing America and doing it in the way that the left typically does, that we're too busy, that we are too concerned with money, that we're too concerned with property, that we're too concerned with owning things, and that we're not concerned enough about things that are spiritual / social / psychological. And so, which was a kind of an interesting argument, again, for him, is considering his background. He comes here to the United States and starts a business and is, at least from what I can tell, very successful at starting this business. He's got a thriving window replacement business, and he takes a great deal of pride in his business, and that's great. And then to come out and say that, to contradict himself and then say, well, this is too materialistic a society, and we should be much more concerned with things that are less material. So materialism comes from the left. And this whole attitude, by the way, comes from the left. It's a typical socialist theme, that a way of criticizing capitalism in general by suggesting that, now that we're capitalists, that we're all too much concerned about chasing the American dream and not spending enough time with our loved ones and not concerned with social / psychological or pursuits that are going to provide social / psychological satisfaction. And so, again, it's typical, and a lot of that, it's also, one of the other things he was going to say, because I just reminded, but was that he was talking about was the idea that all of our problems are of our own creation. As a matter of fact, I think that's exactly what he said, that all of our problems are our own creation. And it's false. And the reason it's false is it ignores metaphysical reality. Ayn Rand identified that there's two realities. You have metaphysical reality and man-made reality. Mountains are metaphysical, buildings are man-made. And in the East, in the Orient, there's the prevalence of that, the attitude that life is a man-made reality completely, and that all you have to do in order to change the world is simply change your attitude. And I've given some examples before. The two examples that I had was in regard to thieves and robbers. They had a story that I read in, I don't remember what book it was, about a prince, somebody in the noble classes from China, and he went to go to see a production or go to dinner or something, but you had to leave your shoes outside. Nobody wears their shoes inside. It's just, part of Chinese culture. Fine. So he has a very expensive, since he's a prince, set of boots. And so he leaves them outside. He comes back, and of course they're gone. So he says, instead of saying, "Oh, a thief has stolen my boots," he says, "Oh, I guess my wearing these expensive boots has led someone to believe that they're a thief." Second story is a Japanese story about a guy that's meditating. He's in his house, and a robber comes in. Early home invasion, because the guy was using a sword. So this is probably going back a couple of centuries. And so he comes in with his sword and looking for money, and the homeowner, still sitting there doing his meditation and not, breaking his rhythm of his breathing or anything like that, tells the guy where the money is, asks him to leave some so he can pay his rent. And so the guy takes whatever money. I don't know if he left the money, enough money for rent or what, but he just took money and left. So then, of course, worried neighbors and police authorities come by within a few minutes and said, "Hey, there's a robber in the neighborhood. Have you seen him?" And this guy says no, but there was a gentleman that came in that borrowed some money. He was a little careless with his sword, but so again, the idea that I didn't get robbed simply because I refused to acknowledge this individual as a robber. It's even simpler, I suppose, is the way to put it. Is we've all heard people say it only bothers you if you let it bother you. No, it bothers you when it makes sense for it to bother you. Somebody robs you at sword point, knife point, gun point. It should bother you. They threaten your life over your possessions. You'll frequently hear the left has influence over the police departments, which will frequently tell you, hey, don't fight or struggle over your possessions, because after all, they're only possessions. Okay, you can always buy something new. Well, that's crap. What possessions and what money stand for is time. Okay, every possession that I have gone out and purchased represents time that I have spent, and time, and to a certain degree risk, but especially time that I've spent working to get the money to get that stuff. So simply saying, "Oh, don't worry about it, it's only stuff," is again left-wing bullshit. Okay, the real question is when somebody's worrying or fretting about something is, are they worrying or fretting about something that makes sense to worry or fret over? If it's a minor, you worrying or fretting over a penny doesn't make as much sense as worrying or fretting over the loss of $1,000. Okay, that makes more sense. But to have a blanket statement where you say, don't worry about possessions or money at all, don't fight, don't struggle in order to keep your possessions, is crap. It's just left-wing crap. But it isn't presented as left-wing anymore. It's presented as just standard, normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill advice, usually coming again from the police department. And you'll hear it from other people. Your friends or your relatives will say the same thing. Don't fight, don't fight. It's only stuff. You can always buy more stuff. No, you can't. That's the whole point. Again, you don't always have the time to go out and earn the money to go ahead and get what you need to replace what was stolen. So, and that point is, that's a metaphysical reality. Metaphysical reality is that I cannot control other people. My attitude isn't going to control other people. My attitude isn't going to prevent somebody from engaging in a home invasion robbery. My attitude isn't going to prevent somebody from stealing my boots. Okay, it's not. It doesn't work that way. Other people are beyond my control. That's a metaphysical reality. Can I control myself in terms of overreaction? Somebody steals my boots, I go hunt them down and cut their head off. No, that's not going to cut it. Same thing if you get your home invasion robbery, you still have issues of justice and acting appropriately. So, but again, with the left is going to have you believe, and they borrow a lot of these ideas from the Orient, that everything is a man-made reality. And so, therefore, in order to change the world, all you have to do is change your attitude. So, baloney. And but again, it's Mr. Liquid Wood, who is normally right of center, is spewing that very same dogma, that very same propaganda. That we spend. It's always we. He doesn't say him. That would be acceptable if he wanted to make the statement more acceptable, and he wants to say, I spend too much time worried about stuff. Well, I can't argue with that. I don't know what he does or doesn't do. But when he starts with we, and he is implying that everybody in the United States is doing this, that's when I got to throw the BS flag and disregard. So I just basically tune out the rest of his message. But again, it's just so interesting because, again, here's a guy who has who's literally living the American dream. Came here from another country, created a business, building it up, successful, and yet he's going to sit here and lecture everybody else about being materialistic. Fascinating. Okay, so today, let's see, we got on tap is little Ayn Rand from the Ayn Rand lexicon, and then it's going to be Tammy Bruce and the Black Book of the American Left. And thank you very much. Welcome back. And so the word for the day today from the Ayn Rand lexicon is censorship. And this is going to be very important for obvious reasons. From the book, censorship is a term pertaining only to governmental action. No private action is censorship. No private individual or agency can silence a man or suppress a publication. Only the government can do so. The freedom of speech of private individuals includes the right not to agree, not to listen, and not to finance one's own antagonists. And this immediately brings to mind Colin Kaepernick. And so, because when Colin came out and was doing his kneeling and all this, everybody was that I was listening to on the radio, usually sports people, sports that has sports shows, were saying, "Oh, freedom of speech, freedom of speech." As though we'd forgotten about that. The First Amendment. No, we haven't. But what they're also don't realize is everybody has freedom of speech. He has the freedom to criticize the government. I have the freedom to criticize him. And as she says, I have the right to disagree. I have the right to ignore him as part of a right of freedom of speech. And I have the right not to finance him. And that's where things have gone right now is you look at the numbers for the NFL, and in terms of its the viewership on television and the people that are attending live games, it's down. And assuming that Colin Kaepernick's kneeling and the kneeling of other football players around the league has had at least some effect or some contribution to that downward message, that falls right into the right not to finance one's antagonists. You're going to go ahead, you're a football player, you're an entertainer, and you want to irritate and annoy me. I have the right to decide I'm not going to go ahead and go to your movie. I'm not going to watch your television show. I'm not going to watch your football game. And there's nothing you can do about it. And that's just as much part of freedom as anything else. Another thing that people forget is the President of the United States has freedom of speech. You don't like his Twitters? Yeah, too bad. He has freedom of speech just like you do. You can tweet whatever you want, so can he. Whether or not whatever he's tweeting is politic, okay, or it is shrewd or smart or advisable, that's a different story. But he can tweet whatever he wants. Back to the book. Censorship, in its old-fashioned meaning, is a government edict that forbids the discussion of some subjects or ideas, such, for instance, as sex, religion, or criticism of government officials. An edict enforced by the government's scrutiny of all forms of communication prior to their public release. But for stifling the freedom of men's minds, the modern method is much more potent. It rests on the power of non-objective law. It neither forbids nor permits anything. It never defines or specifies. It merely delivers men's lives, fortunes, careers, ambitions into the arbitrary power of a bureaucrat who can reward or punish at whim. It spares the bureaucrat the troublesome necessity of committing himself to rigid rules, and it places upon the victims the burden of discovering how to please him with a fluid, unknowable as their only guide. And which reminds me of my foster parents, particularly my foster mother. And they were very arbitrary and very much like capricious, just like what she was describing here, that is a fluid unknowable as the only guide. If you tried to, and I did on several occasions, nail them down, so to speak, in other words, get them to define what it is they're looking for, how they're looking for it, etc., they would get pissed off. They would get mad, and very often you'd get some sort of a punishment. If you didn't get yelled at, maybe you got slapped or sent to your room or something of that nature. But and all of that is based on the whole idea of that, of not defining, of not committing yourself to a rigid rule, is power. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want. So, and yeah. Back to the book. No, a federal commissioner may never utter a single word for or against any program, but what do you suppose will happen if and when, with or without his knowledge, a third assistant or a second cousin, or just a nameless friend from Washington whispers to a television executive that the commissioner does not like producer X or does not approve writer Y or takes a great interest in the career of starlet Z or is anxious to advance the cause of the United Nations? And also, which brings up a point that it seems to me that the power in laws, in creating laws, is not the creation of the law itself, but in creating exemptions. Okay. Back to the book. For years, the collectivists have been propagating the notion that a private individual's refusal to finance an opponent is a violation of the opponent's right of free speech and an act of censorship. It is censorship, they claim, if a newspaper refuses to employ or publish writers whose ideas are diametrically opposed to its policy. It is censorship, they claim, if businessmen refuse to advertise in a magazine that denounces, insults, and smears them. And then there is Newton N. Minow, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, who declares there is censorship by ratings, by advertisers, by networks, by affiliates, which reject programming offered to their areas. It is the same Mr. Minow who threatens to revoke the license of any station that does not comply with his views on programming and who claims that it is not censorship. This collectivist notion means that the ability to provide the material tools for the expression of ideas deprives a man of the right to hold any ideas. It means that a publisher has to publish books he considers worthless, false, or evil, that a TV sponsor has to finance commentators who choose to affront his convictions, that the owner of a newspaper must turn his editorial pages over to any young hooligan who clamors for the enslavement of the press. It means that one group of men acquires the right to unlimited license, while another group is reduced to helpless irresponsibility. So that's our segment of the Ayn Rand Lexicon, Objectivism from A to Z. And when we come back, it will be Tammy Bruce. Thank you. And Tammy Bruce, The Death of Right and Wrong is her book. Should have been titled something to the effect of The Changing of Right and Wrong. Because right and wrong will never, ever be obliterated. It'll just be changed, perhaps. Okay, so that what's right and wrong today will be different tomorrow, especially if you end up with socialists running the country. Socialists still believe in right and wrong. They just have their own brand of right and wrong. So anyways, in her book, when we left this off, she was talking about how Christians have become targets of the left, and that they're very often slandered and maligned, put down, and just generally treated badly. So this section here in this chapter is called Not What I Expected. Bear in mind, I'm not a religious person. I was not raised with any religious background or encouragement. I remain suspicious of any massively organized effort, whether it be Enron, the federal government, the National Organization for Women, or the Catholic Church. I see the potential for groupthink and bureaucracies gone wild. That being said, the values at the heart of an organization or movement, fortunately, are immune from the follies of its elite. People of faith know this, and so do, dare I say, the left elite. You see, it is the cardinal virtues, the immutable ideas which are wrapped in the vulnerable bureaucracies representative of Christianity in this world that are most threatening to the left. The best way to attack the ideas is to damage the container, the institution, and its symbols. These days, with such things no longer routinely being taught, it's worth noting what I mean when I speak of virtues. I must admit, if you had asked me even 5 years ago what the cardinal virtues were, I would have looked at you with a blank face. I had no clue. But now, when I speak of transcendent values, the virtues promoted by Christianity that so intensely threaten the left, it is the cardinal virtues I speak of: prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. A few years ago, I read for the first time some of C.S. Lewis's essays on Christianity. Lewis was one of the intellectual giants of the 20th century and arguably the most influential Christian writer of his day. What appealed to me about Lewis, and what in my view makes his work so strong, is that he presents a rational argument about Christianity that appeals to the intellect. Although his work overall has made a great impression on me, it has also allowed me the freedom to acknowledge and accept certain aspects of Christianity and Christian values without dismissing my critical assessment of what happens when man gets his hands on a good idea. Lewis made it possible for me to understand and appreciate the magnificence of the cardinal virtues as an element of Christianity, with it making complete intellectual sense. Lewis does not persuade, he demonstrates. Mere common sense. Lewis's Mere Christianity is one of the most popular introductions to the Christian faith ever written. In it, Lewis offers an explanation of the 7 virtues, 4 of which are the cardinal virtues, with the other 3 being the theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity. These also, frankly, are nothing to sneeze at. Lewis does a reader like myself a favor, however, by separating the 2 categories, recognizing the fact that not all his readers embrace Christian theology. Lewis makes it quite clear how the cardinal virtues apply to everyone and already play a natural role in our lives. Cardinal, by the way, does not refer to the men in red robes, but is essentially the same word. It comes from the Latin cardo, meaning a hinge, that on which a thing turns, its principal point. The cardinal virtues are the 4 principal virtues upon which the rest of the moral virtues turn or are hinged. Classical Greek philosophers identified the foremost virtues as prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. Early Christian theologians adopted these virtues and considered them equally important to all people, whether Christian or not. So, and there's a book out by Piper, and Joachim Piper. I think he was a German, I think actually a cardinal or bishop of some sort, but he was in the Catholic Church. But he wrote a book on the four cardinal virtues, and very much worth reading. It gives some detailed explanations of each one of those virtues, and the lead one, the one on which everything else depends on, is prudence. So, and again, here's another reason why I like Tammy Bruce is depth, isn't it? Another way to put it. I like the fact that not only does she have insight into what makes the left tick, but she has insights into what makes conservatives tick. Okay, and that Christianity is part of it, and why Christianity is important to the right. So, when we pick up on this again next time, we'll be going into details about the cardinal virtues, each one of them. So that's coming up next. But next time, which will probably be next week when we come back to her book, The Death of Right and Wrong. So when we come back, I'm going to be picking up where I left off on the book, the Black Book of the American Left by David Horowitz. And thank you very much. And we're at Chapter 9 of The Black Book of the American Left by David Horowitz, who was a former communist and activist. And so he became, after the death of a friend of his at the hands of the Black Panthers, he re-examined his political viewpoints and became a conservative. So, Chapter 9, Letter to the Past. 25 years ago on this date exactly, my friend Betty Van Patter disappeared from the Berkeley Square, a local tavern on University Avenue, and was never seen alive again. 6 months earlier, I had recruited Betty to keep the books of the Educational Opportunities Corporation, an entity I had created to run a school for the children of the Black Panther Party. By the time the police fished her battered body out of San Francisco Bay, I knew that she had been killed by the Panthers themselves. At the time, the Panthers were still being defended by writers like Murray Kempton and Gary Wills in the pages of the New York Times, and by the governor of California, Jerry Brown. Indeed, the governor was a confidant of Elaine Brown, who had hired Betty and whom Huey Newton had appointed to stand in for him as the Panthers' leader when he fled to Cuba. At the time of Betty's death, Elaine was writing a wave of public approval. She was running for the Oakland City Council and had just secured a $250,000 grant from the Nixon administration under a federal juvenile delinquency program. J. Anthony Klein, the consigliere to whom she had turned when the party's enforcers got into trouble with the law, was about to be appointed to Governor Brown's cabinet and is today a justice on the First Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. In pursuit of answers to the mystery of Betty's death, I subsequently discovered that the Panthers had killed more than a dozen people in the course of conducting extortion, prostitution, and drug rackets in the Oakland ghetto. While these criminal activities were taking place, they enjoyed the support of the American left, the Democrat Party, the Bay Area Trades Union Council, and even the Oakland business establishment. The head of the Clorox Corporation, Oakland's largest company, sat on the board of the Educational Opportunities Corporation I had created and whose books Betty had kept. On a far smaller scale, the Panther killings were an American version of the Katyn Massacre, an infamous murder of Polish officers carried out on Stalin's orders that the left had denied and concealed for decades until the opening of the Soviet archives settled the dispute for good. The totalitarian nature of the Soviet state made it relatively simple to understand how the information that would settle the case could be kept hidden for years. It It was much harder for me to understand why in democratic America the Panthers should be able to get away with these murders and why the nation's press should turn such a blind eye to a group that law enforcement had made an object of its attentions. Whatever the reasons, the fact remains that to this day, not a single organization of the mainstream press has ever investigated the Panther murders, even though the story is one that touches the lives and political careers of the entire liberal establishment, including the First Lady and the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil rights for the Clinton administration. Both Hillary Clinton and Bill Land Lee began their political careers as law students at Yale by organizing demonstrations in 1970 to shut down the university and stop the trial of Panther leaders who had tortured and then executed a black youth named Alex Rackley. The silence is even more puzzling since, despite a blackout by national media, the details of the story have managed to trickle out over the years. This has been the result of efforts by myself and my colleague Peter Collier, by radical journalists Kate Coleman and Hugh Pearson, and one or two others, including most particularly David Talbot and David Weir, the editor and managing editor of Salon magazine. Because of our efforts, informed citizens are at least aware of these murders. On the other hand, unlike in the Soviet Union, where testimonies emerged as soon as the regime was toppled and the threat of retaliation gone, few additional witnesses have come forward to add to our knowledge about these American crimes. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of veterans of the 60s who have some knowledge of the deeds, but who have remained silent and complicit for 25 years. These include notable figures like Tom Hayden and journalists like the Los Angeles Times columnist Robert Scheer, both of whom promoted the Panthers as revolutionary heroes at the time and who have failed to correct that impression ever since. But it also includes many lesser figures who worked day in and day out to facilitate the Panthers' rise to power and cover up their crimes along the way. Evidently, they have remained convinced that even though the crimes were committed, they somehow weren't. Or perhaps that if they were indeed committed, the crimes were and are no responsibility of theirs. I'm constantly asked by people who have read my autobiography, Radical Son, or who have heard me talk about these events, how it is that my former comrades on the left can remain so stubbornly devoted to experiments that have failed, to doctrines that are false, to causes that are demonstrably wrong-headed and evil. Recently, on November 20th, to be precise, an answer to these questions came out of the blue. In a letter written by an old friend, Art Goldberg, a radical journalist who is deeply involved in the activities of the Panthers and their deceptions, and who remains a faithful keeper of the progressive flame today. I had not heard from Art in 15 years. We had grown up on the same block in Sunnyside, Long Island, a neighborhood of Queens that had been colonized by the Communist Party, to which both our parents belonged. Because Art was a few years older than I, we weren't that close as children, but became friends after college, when we found ourselves together in Berkeley as members of the nascent New Left. Art became a writer for the Berkeley Barb and other movement papers and made himself particularly serviceable to the Black Panther Party. Toward the end of the 60s, Peter Collier and I were editing Ramparts, the most successful and well-heeled journalistic institution of the left. Because Art was an old friend of mine, we took him under our wing and gave him writing jobs that supplemented his income, while Peter devoted considerable time and effort to rewriting Art's pieces to meet the literary standards of a national magazine, which were somewhat more demanding than those of an underground paper like the Berkeley Barb. So valuable was Art's propaganda to the Panthers that eventually Huey Newton assigned him to write the official biography of Charles Gary, the lawyer who defended Newton against charges that he had murdered a young policeman named John Frey. Newton had committed the murder, but in Art's account, as in all the writings of the New Leftists at the time, Huey was presented as the innocent victim of a racist conspiracy by the state. Art and another friend named Marty Kenner were the New Leftists closest to the Panthers of anyone I knew. Marty, a stockbroker who had organized the famous Leonard Bernstein party that Tom Wolfe satirized in Radical Chic, was working virtually full-time as Huey Newton's personal emissary and financial guru. In the 60s, I had kept my distance from the party because I was frightened by their gun-toting style and hectoring posture. As the 70s began, however, Newton announced that it was time to put away the gun, and I became involved with the school project I've already mentioned. At first, I intended just to raise money for the school, But when Marty Kenner withdrew unexpectedly, telling me he was burned out, I was left with the task of organizing the school myself. It was a result of this responsibility that I recruited Betty Van Patter to keep its books. So this is a fairly long chapter, and I'm going to go ahead and conclude it, wrap it up right here, this part of the chapter, and then next week we'll come back and finish it off. But again, it's interesting the insight that he has as to the goings-on of the Black Panther Party and the left in general. One of the most interesting things about it, and that people need to understand, none of us are going to be members of the Black Panther Party or necessarily writing articles in support of the Black Panthers or the leftists or whatever, but is understanding that the left has always presented itself with a happy face. They always try to present as though they're having fun, and that's the way they try to present themselves in terms of attracting people. We're fun-loving, we're smiling, we're happy, and for the most part, they are, until you get to the point where you tell them no. It's like what I say about if you have friends or people that are in your life, let's put it that way, that are lefties. They're not your friends. Okay? You can pretend they're your friends if you want. Nobody can stop you from doing it, but they're not your friends. And if you doubt that, try telling them no sometime. And tell them no without an explanation. They ask you, can you do this? Can you do me a favor? And just say, no, I can't do that. I'm sorry. Have a nice day. And see how they respond. And more than likely, they're going to respond with shock. They're going to give you a dirty look. They're going to be manipulative. They're going to start, very often, they're going to start snarling at you. Okay, because that's, as Ayn Rand has identified, that when you tell a lefty no, or you stand up to a lefty, that's when the snarling starts. That's when they get really nasty. Like the guy at the unemployment office that I was dealing with that lied to me to get me to come in and attend a particular meeting. Everything was hunky-dory until I confronted him about his lie, and then he got nasty about it. His tone of voice got nasty. His whole attitude became nasty. It was he turned on a dime. And so that's, again, in this chapter, he's demonstrating how, again, if you're going along with the program, everybody on the left loves you. But if you start to question things, that's when the snarling starts. That's when they get very threatening, gun-toting, as he put it. Let's see. Gun-toting and gun-toting style and hectoring posture. And that's when that always starts. You tell them no, confront them about something, and you're going to get to the real lefties and their real attitudes. So when I come back, a couple of jokes from the New York City Cab Drivers Joke Book. Thank you very much. Let's see where we were at here. Huh. Oh yeah. All right. Well, let's go ahead with this one. I don't think I did this one last time. A young couple is having marital problems. They go to a marriage counselor, and he says to them, first, we could start by discussing your sex life. For instance, how often do you make love? The young man says, well, doctor, we make love every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 10 o'clock. You mean, says the doctor, that you make love on a schedule? Sure, says the man. Doesn't everybody? No, replies the doctor. Love is a very beautiful, spontaneous thing. When the feeling comes upon you, you've got to act on it. Be a little impulsive now and then. Now, go out this week, he continues, and try to follow your feelings. Then come back next week and we'll discuss it. The following week, when the couple comes in, they're holding hands, and the doctor can see that there is a certain glow about them. They're smiling at each other, and they're acting a little shy. So the doctor says, I see that it's been a special week for you. Would you care to tell me about it? Well, doctor, says the young man, smiling and looking at his wife, The day after we saw you, we were having breakfast, and I looked across at her, and she looked across at me, and before we knew it, we were making love right there on the table. It was very exciting. The doctor is so pleased for them. That is wonderful, he says. Yeah, says the young man, but I don't think they're ever going to let us into the Howard Johnsons again. And with that, we conclude another episode of The Drill, and I thank you for listening, and until next time, have a great day.